crystal spires of Luminara reached toward twin suns like prayers frozen in glass, their surfaces shimmering with the collected light of 1,000 royal generations. But in the Hall of Judgment, where bloodlines were weighed against prophecy and tradition, one princess stood in shadow. Kaelith's skin flickered wrong, her bioluminescence stuttering like a dying star, while her sisters glowed steady and true. The Council of Elders had made their decision. She would be traded away, sent to the human colonies where defective things went to disappear. And in a repair bay at the edge of known space, a mechanic named Marcus Reid was about to receive a delivery that would change everything he thought he knew about Worth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The Hall of Judgment smelled of ozone and ancient stone, a scent that clung to Kaelith's skin like accusation. She stood at the center of the circular chamber, her bare feet against marble that had witnessed 10,000 verdicts before hers. Above her, the crystalline dome filtered sunlight into ribbons of color that danced across the faces of the 7 elders, each seated upon thrones carved from meteor glass. They watched her with eyes that held no mercy, only the cold mathematics of survival. Kaelith's mother, Queen Sereth, sat highest among them, her face a mask of royal composure that refused to crack even as she condemned her own daughter. Elder Morvex spoke first, his voice like stones grinding together. The luminescence test has concluded. The results are irrefutable. He gestured toward the pulsing orb suspended between them, its surface still rippling with the echoes of Kaelith's failed attempt. Every member of the royal bloodline could synchronize their bioluminescence with the Heartstone, creating patterns that proved their divine right to rule. Every member except one. Kaelith's light had flickered erratically, refusing to match the ancient rhythms, creating discordant flashes that made the elders recoil. Her 3 sisters had passed the test at age 12. Kaelith was now 23, and her skin still pulsed with a frequency that belonged to no known pattern. Defective, Morvex continued, and the word fell like an executioner's blade. Unsuitable for marriage alliances, unsuitable for court positions, unsuitable for any role that might require trust from our allied systems. The other elders murmured agreement, their own luminescence flickering in synchronized disapproval. Kaelith wanted to speak, to defend herself, to ask why her difference made her worthless. But she had learned long ago that questions from a flawed princess were considered insubordination. Her mother finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 10 generations. The treaty with the human colonies requires payment for the resources they have provided. Our treasury is depleted from the war efforts. We will offer Kaelith a settlement. The humans have expressed interest in studying our biology. She will serve as both payment and research opportunity. The words were clinical, stripped of any motherhood or grief. Queen Sereth had already mourned her daughter years ago when the first test came back wrong. Elder Yasmin, the youngest of the 7, shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, surely there are other options. She is still of royal blood. Morvex cut her off with a sharp gesture. Royal blood that cannot prove itself is just blood. We cannot afford sentiment. He turned to Kaelith, his multifaceted eyes reflecting her image 100 times over. You will be prepared for transport within 3 cycles. A human vessel will arrive to collect you. Consider this mercy. Kaelith felt something crack inside her chest, a sensation like glass breaking in slow motion. She bowed her head, not in acceptance but in survival. And when she looked up again, her mother had already turned away. Threshold Station clung to the asteroid belt like rust on old iron, a patchwork of salvaged hull plating and recycled air that wheezed through ventilation shafts older than most of its inhabitants. Marcus Reid's repair bay occupied the lowest level, where the gravity generators worked only when they felt like it, and the walls sweated condensation that tasted like metal and regret. He preferred it that way. Down here, people left him alone. The hum of his plasma welder filled the silence as he worked on a thruster assembly, sparks cascading across his oil-stained work shirt like tiny dying stars. His hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, guided by instinct more than sight. After 15 years of coaxing broken things back to life, the bay doors groaned open without warning, and cold air rushed in carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something that smelled like flowers Marcus had only seen in photographs from Earth. He didn't look up immediately, finishing the weld seam before killing the torch and pushing his safety goggles onto his forehead. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the corridor lights, their shadows stretching across his workspace like accusations. 2 were tall, their bodies wrapped in the ceremonial robes of Luminaran diplomats, fabric that shifted colors with each movement. The 3rd figure was smaller, hunched, with hands bound in what looked like silver wire that pulsed with faint light. Marcus Reid, the first diplomat's voice had the quality of wind chimes, beautiful and hollow. "We come on behalf of the Luminaran Crown to complete the transaction outlined in Contract 7 Theta 9. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tightening. He knew about 7 Theta 9, a supply agreement he'd inherited when he bought the bay from the previous owner. Medical equipment and rare earth minerals in exchange for technical support and docking privileges. But the contract had been fulfilled months ago, or so he'd thought. "Contract's closed," Marcus said, his voice rough from disuse. "Paid in full last quarter." The second diplomat stepped forward, and Marcus caught his first clear look at the bound figure between them. She was humanoid but not human, her skin emanating a soft, irregular glow that pulsed like a heartbeat struggling to find its rhythm. Her eyes were large and dark, fixed on the floor with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned not to hope. Her silver hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her clothing, though fine, hung on her frame like it belonged to someone else. "The final payment remains," the first diplomat said, gesturing toward the girl. "Princess Kaelith, blood of the royal line, offered as settlement for outstanding cultural exchange obligations." The words came out smooth and rehearsed, a transaction explained in the language of bureaucracy. "She is defective by our standards but may serve human purposes, research, manual labor, whatever use you determine appropriate." The diplomat produced a data pad, its screen glowing with contract language. Marcus didn't need to read to understand what they were really saying. "You're giving me a person," Marcus said slowly, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "As payment." The diplomat's expression didn't change. "We are fulfilling contractual obligations. What you do with the merchandise is your concern." Kaelith's glow flickered once, sharp and bright, before dimming back to its irregular pulse. She still hadn't raised her eyes. And Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years, the hot simmer of anger that made his voice drop to a dangerous quiet. Marcus set the data pad down on his workbench without reading it, the metal surface clanging louder than he intended. The diplomats exchanged a glance, their luminescence shifting to a color Marcus had learned meant confusion. He took a step forward, deliberately placing himself between them and the girl they'd called Kaelith. His work boots scraped against the grated floor, the sound echoing in the sudden tension that filled his bay like static before a storm. The first diplomat's face remained serene, but his fingers twitched toward the ceremonial blade at his hip. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," the diplomat said, his musical voice taking on an edge. "The contract is legally binding under both Luminaran and colonial law. Refusal constitutes breach, which carries significant penalties." Marcus crossed his arms, his shoulders squared in a posture that had once made drunken miners think twice about starting fights. "I don't traffic in people. Find another way to settle your debt." The second diplomat laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She is not people, Mr. Reid. She is defective property that her own bloodline has deemed worthless. We offer you a gift, and you insult us with false morality." Kaelith's glow pulsed once, brighter than before, and Marcus caught the slight intake of her breath. She was listening, he realized, perhaps hearing herself defended for the first time in her life. The silver bindings around her wrists glowed brighter, and he noticed the way they bit into her skin, leaving marks that looked almost like burns. The sight made something twist in his gut, a memory of his sister wearing similar marks before the labor camps had finally killed her. He'd been too young then to do anything but watch. He wasn't young anymore. "Take the bindings off her," Marcus said quietly. The first diplomat's expression hardened. "She is bound for transport security. She remains bound until transfer of ownership is complete." Marcus reached for the heavy wrench on his workbench, not as a threat, but as punctuation. "I said take them off. Now." The second diplomat's hand moved to his blade, but Kaelith spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, do not fight over me. I am not worth bloodshed." Her accent was soft, each word carefully shaped, as if she'd learned the human language from recordings rather than conversation. Marcus turned to look at her directly, and she flinched, an instinct born from too many harsh gazes, but he kept his voice gentle when he spoke. "You don't get to decide your own worth based on what they told you." He looked back at the diplomats. "Here's how this works. You remove those bindings, you leave my bay, and you tell whoever sent you that Marcus Reid doesn't accept people as payment, defective or otherwise. The contract can stay unfulfilled for all I care." The first diplomat's luminescence flared red. "This is breach of contract. We will report this to the Colonial Trade Authority. You will lose your business license, your docking privileges, everything." Marcus shrugged, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Then I lose it, but I don't lose sleep." The silence that followed felt like the moment before an explosion, everyone waiting to see who would move first. The diplomats left with threats that hung in the air like smoke, their robes sweeping across the bay floor in indignant arcs of color. But they had removed the bindings first, dropping them at Marcus's feet where they clattered and dimmed. Kaelith stood exactly where they'd left her, rubbing her wrists where the silver had burned crescents into her pale skin. Her luminescence flickered uncertainly, casting moving shadows across the cluttered workspace. Marcus watched her from the corner of his eye while pretending to organize tools that didn't need organizing. He had no idea what to do with a princess, defective or otherwise. "You can sit," he finally said, gesturing toward the workbench stool. "If you want." Kaelith didn't move for several heartbeats, as if the concept of choice required translation. Then she lowered herself onto the stool with the careful precision of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced to hide the trembling. Marcus went back to the thruster assembly, giving her the dignity of not being stared at. The plasma welder hummed back to life, and he lost himself in the familiar rhythm of repair. Minutes passed, then an hour. Kaelith didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations for why he'd turned away a contract that might have benefited him. She simply watched him work with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle. He could feel her gaze tracking his movements as he disassembled the thruster housing, cleaned each component with solvent that stung his already raw knuckles, and began the meticulous process of reassembly. His hands knew the work so well he could do it blind, muscle memory carrying him through while his mind churned with questions he didn't know how to ask. When the station's artificial night cycle kicked in and the overhead lights dimmed to their evening setting, Marcus finally set down his tools and stretched. His spine cracked in 3 places, and he rolled his shoulders with a grunt. Kaelith's glow had settled into a softer rhythm, less erratic than before, though still nothing like the synchronized pulses he'd seen from other Luminarans during trade negotiations. Her eyes had dark circles beneath them, exhaustion written in the slight droop of her shoulders. "There's a storage room in the back," Marcus said, wiping grease from his hands. "It's got a cot and some blankets. Not fancy, but it's clean and warm." Kaelith's eyes widened slightly. "You are offering me shelter?" Her voice carried disbelief, as if kindness was a language she'd forgotten. Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "Can't have you sleeping on the floor. Bad for business." It was a lie, and they both knew it. His business rarely saw customers, and the ones who did come wouldn't care about a sleeping alien. Kaelith rose from the stool, her movements graceful despite her obvious fatigue. "Thank you," she whispered, and the sincerity in those 2 words made Marcus's chest tighten. He nodded once and turned back to his workbench, listening to her soft footsteps disappear into the back room. The bay felt larger somehow with her gone, empty in a way it hadn't been before she'd arrived. Marcus looked down at his oil-stained hands and wondered what he'd just gotten himself into. 3 days passed in a rhythm of careful avoidance and quiet coexistence. Kaelith emerged each morning after Marcus had already started work, moving through the bay like a ghost who feared disturbing the living. She watched him repair coolant systems and recalibrate navigation arrays, her presence so still that he sometimes forgot she was there until her luminescence caught his peripheral vision. She never asked for anything, never complained about the meager rations he shared from his storage locker, never questioned why he'd refused to send her back. The silence between them grew comfortable in the way that silence between two broken things often does. On the 4th morning, Marcus noticed something that made him pause mid-weld. Kaelith had moved closer to his workspace than usual. Drawn by the exposed engine core he'd been examining, the core contained fragments of stellarium, a rare mineral used in faster-than-light drives, and it pulsed with a faint blue light that matched no known spectrum. Most people couldn't see the pulse at all without specialized equipment, but Kaelith's skin had begun to glow in response, her erratic luminescence suddenly matching the stellarium's frequency with perfect precision. The synchronization lasted only seconds before her light scattered back into its irregular pattern, but Marcus had seen enough. He killed the welder and pulled off his gloves, his mind racing through implications. "Come here," he said, softer than he intended. Kaelith hesitated, clearly uncertain whether she'd done something wrong. "Please," he added, and she approached with small, cautious steps. Marcus gestured toward the stellarium fragments. "Look at these and tell me what you see." Kaelith leaned forward, her silver hair falling across her face, and her glow immediately shifted to match the mineral's frequency again. This time it held steady, her skin pulsing in perfect harmony with the stellarium like two instruments, finally playing the same note. "I see light," she whispered. "Deep light, older than stars. It sings a frequency my people say does not exist." Her hand hovered near the fragments but didn't touch, as if afraid contact might break whatever magic was happening. Marcus pulled up his datapad and ran a spectral analysis, watching the numbers scroll across the screen. The frequency Kaelith was emitting registered in a range that standard Luminaran biology couldn't access, a wavelength that corresponded with ancient navigation beacons from civilizations long extinct. His hands stilled on the controls. "You're not defective," Marcus said, and the words came out rougher than he meant them. "You're tuned to something else, something your people forgot how to hear." Kaelith turned to face him, her eyes wide with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite name. "Hope, maybe. Or fear of hope. My mother said I was broken, that my light was wrong, that I could not pulse with the Heartstone because I was flawed." Her voice cracked on the last word, years of internalized shame bleeding through. Marcus shook his head, pulling up more data on his screen. "Your mother was wrong. This frequency you're emitting, it matches deep space stellarium deposits, the kind that mark old trade routes through uncharted space. You're not broken, Princess. You're a map to places everyone else forgot existed." Kaelith's luminescence flared bright enough to cast sharp shadows across the entire bay, her hand flying to her chest as if trying to hold something in that wanted desperately to break free. The bay doors crashed open 6 days after Marcus's refusal, and this time the diplomats brought reinforcements. 4 Luminaran guards flanked the entrance, their ceremonial armor replaced with tactical gear that hummed with contained energy. The first diplomat strode in with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no twice, his luminescence pulsing with barely restrained fury. Marcus didn't look up from the navigation console he was calibrating, but his hand moved subtly toward the plasma cutter on his workbench. Kaelith, who'd been organizing spare parts across the room, went perfectly still. "Your grace period has expired, Mr. Reid," the diplomat announced, his musical voice now edged with steel. "The Colonial Trade Authority has reviewed your breach of contract. You have 2 options: complete the transaction immediately, or face license revocation and criminal charges for theft of Luminaran property." He gestured sharply toward Kaelith, who had pressed herself against the far wall, her glow dimming to almost nothing. "She returns with us. Now." Marcus finally looked up, his expression calm in the way that preceded violence. "She's not property. We've been through this." The second diplomat stepped forward, producing a document that shimmered with official seals. Legally, she is exactly that. Princess Kaelith was declared incompetent by royal decree due to her genetic defect. She has no rights under Luminaran law, and your colony has no jurisdiction over internal Luminaran matters. The words fell like hammer blows, each one designed to strip away any moral high ground Marcus thought he stood on. One of the guards moved toward Kaelith, his hand outstretched. She flinched backward, her shoulders hitting the wall with a dull thud. The guard's fingers were inches from her arm when Marcus spoke, his voice dropping to a register that made everyone in the bay freeze. "Touch her and you'll lose that hand." The guard hesitated, looking back at the diplomats for direction. The first diplomat's luminescence flared red. "You threaten royal guards. This is beyond breach of contract. This is assault on foreign officials." "Self-defense," Marcus corrected, moving to place himself between the guard and Kaelith. "You broke into my workspace uninvited and attempted to kidnap someone under my protection." The diplomat laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Protection? You are a mechanic with no legal standing and mounting debt. You protect nothing." His expression shifted to something almost pitying. "We are not unreasonable, Mr. Reid. We will even compensate you for your emotional attachment. 5,000 credits, and we forget this incident ever happened." Kaelith's breath caught audibly, and Marcus felt her hand touch his shoulder, light as whisper. "Please," she said softly, speaking for the first time since the diplomats had arrived. "Do not sacrifice everything for me. I am not worth your livelihood." Marcus turned his head slightly, catching her eyes. The fear there was real, but beneath it he saw something else. A flicker of the frequency he'd discovered, the hidden map that made her invaluable rather than worthless. "Yes, you are," he said simply, then looked back at the diplomats. "Get out of my bay, come back with actual authority, or don't come back at all." The first diplomat's face twisted with rage, his hand moving toward a communicator. "You have made a grave mistake, human, one you will regret before this cycle ends." The diplomats left with promises of swift retribution, their guards forming a tight formation as they retreated through the bay doors. Marcus watched them go, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. When the doors finally sealed, he released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Kaelith remained pressed against the wall, her luminescence flickering with emotions Marcus was learning to read. Fear, yes, but also something that looked like wonder. She studied him as if he were a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, a creature whose motivations made no sense in the world she'd known. "You should not have done that," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Marcus shrugged, returning to his workbench with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline. "Probably not, but I'm not good at doing what I should." He picked up a wrench, needing something to do with his hands, something to ground him before the reality of what he'd just done crashed over him completely. His business license would be revoked by morning. The trade authority didn't forgive breaches of this magnitude, not when foreign royalty was involved. The comm panel on the wall crackled to life before he could spiral further. "Marcus Reid, this is Senna Vox from Bay 72. Word spreading about what you did." The voice was rough, feminine. Belonging to a salvage operator, Marcus had fixed a fuel converter for last year. "There's a gathering forming at the Rust Garden if you're interested. Seems you're not the only one tired of being told what's property and what's not." The comm clicked off before Marcus could respond, leaving him staring at the speaker in confusion. Kaelith moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "What is the Rust Garden?" Marcus set down the wrench, something stirring in his chest that felt dangerously close to hope. "It's a bar in the lower levels, where the station's outcasts drink and trade stories." He'd been there exactly twice in 15 years, both times to fix their failing environmental systems. The owner, a former colony marine named Thresh, ran it as a haven for people the station preferred to forget. "We should go," he said, surprising himself with the decision. The Rust Garden lived up to its name, all corroded metal and salvaged furniture that looked like it had survived multiple wars. But when Marcus and Kaelith arrived, the space was packed with faces he recognized from the margins of station life. salvagers, dock workers, independent traders who operated outside the corporate contracts. Senna Vox stood near the bar, her cybernetic arm gleaming in the low light. Thresh himself, a mountain of a man with scars that mapped his violent history, nodded once at Marcus before gesturing to an empty table. "Heard you told the Luminarans where to shove their contract," Senna said as Marcus and Kaelith approached. Her eyes lingered on Kaelith with curiosity rather than judgment. "About time someone did." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus looked around, seeing his own defiance reflected in dozens of faces. These were people who'd been discarded, deemed worthless, told they didn't matter. They understood what it meant to be traded like cargo. Thresh raised a glass, his voice carrying across the bar, to the mechanic who remembered that some things can't be bought. The crowd echoed the toast, and for the first time since the diplomats had arrived, Marcus felt like he might not be facing this alone. Marcus spent the next 3 days building something he'd never attempted before. The device took shape on his workbench piece by piece. A lattice of crystalline conductors wrapped around a stellarium core he'd salvaged from a decommissioned navigation beacon. Kaelith watched from her usual spot, her presence now familiar enough that the silence between them felt like conversation. When he finally powered it on, the device hummed with a frequency that made her skin pulse in immediate response, her luminescence synchronizing perfectly with the output signal. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer with cautious steps. Marcus adjusted a dial, fine-tuning the resonance. "An amplifier. If I'm right about your frequency, this should let us map what you're actually seeing." He pulled up a holographic display, its empty grid waiting to be filled. "Touch the contact points." Kaelith hesitated, her fingers hovering over the copper nodes. Years of being told her difference was dangerous made every new experience feel like a test she might fail. But Marcus's steady gaze held no judgment, only curiosity, and something that looked like belief. She pressed her palms against the nodes, and the device flared to life. Her luminescence intensified, no longer erratic but purposeful, pulsing in waves that the amplifier translated into visible patterns. The holographic display erupted with light, revealing a 3-dimensional map of space that made Marcus's breath catch. Trade routes appeared like veins of gold threading through darkness, connecting star systems in patterns that didn't match any current navigation charts. These were old paths, ancient highways that civilizations had used before humanity even discovered fire. "I see them," Kaelith whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "I have always seen them, but I thought they were dreams, visions that proved my mind was as broken as my light." Her voice cracked with emotion. "They are real," Marcus nodded, already recording the data streaming across his console. "They're real, and they're valuable. Some of these routes could cut travel time between systems by months. Your people didn't lose you because you were defective. They lost something precious because they stopped listening." Kaelith pulled her hands back, and the display faded to darkness. But her luminescence remained bright, steady, no longer the stuttering rhythm of something broken but the confident pulse of something found. She looked at Marcus with tears gathering in her dark eyes. "You have given me back myself," she said softly. "I do not know how to repay such a gift." Marcus shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt too large for his small acts of decency. "You don't owe me anything," he said, shutting down the amplifier. "You never did." But even as he spoke, he knew they'd created something together that neither could have built alone. Her ability to see the frequencies, his skill to translate them into usable data. It was partnership, the kind built on mutual respect rather than transaction. Outside the bay, station lights flickered as the artificial day cycle began. And somewhere in the administrative levels, Marcus knew the diplomats were planning their next move. But for this moment, standing in the glow of Kaelith's steady light, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The message arrived at dawn, projected directly onto Marcus's workbench by official colonial transmission. Queen Sereth's face materialized in holographic blue, her expression carved from ice and ancient authority. Behind her, the 7 elders stood in formation, their luminescence synchronized in a display meant to intimidate. Marcus stopped mid-weld, and Kaelith emerged from the back room, drawn by the unmistakable timbre of her mother's voice. She froze when she saw the projection, her own light dimming instinctively as if trying to disappear. "Marcus Reid." The Queen's voice echoed through the bay with ceremonial weight. "You harbor stolen property of the Luminaran crown. Our patience has expired. Princess Kaelith will return within 24 hours, or we will consider your actions an act of war against our sovereignty. The Colonial Trade Authority has agreed to our terms. You have no legal protection, no recourse, no allies with sufficient power to oppose us." She paused, and her eyes seemed to look directly through the recording at her daughter. "Kaelith, you will return and accept your place. This defiance serves no purpose but prolonging inevitable shame." The hologram flickered, replaced by Elder Morvex, whose mandibles clicked with satisfaction. "A transport vessel arrives tomorrow at station midnight. The princess will board willingly, or we will extract her by force. Mr. Reid, you face 20 years imprisonment for trafficking in royal persons. We show mercy only if compliance is immediate." The transmission ended, leaving silence that pressed against Marcus's ears like deep water. He turned to find Kaelith standing rigid, her hands clenched at her sides, her luminescence pulsing erratically again, as if all the progress they'd made had evaporated in her mother's cold pronouncement. "I must go back," Kaelith said, her voice hollow. "I cannot let you face imprisonment for my sake. I am not worth your freedom." Marcus set down his tools, his jaw tight with frustration. "Stop deciding your own worth based on their lies." But Kaelith shook her head, tears tracking down her cheeks, catching the light of her own skin. "What choice do I have? They will take me regardless. At least if I surrender, you will not suffer." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking smaller than he'd ever seen her. Marcus moved closer, careful not to crowd her. "You have more choices than you think. The routes you can see, the frequencies you carry, they're not just scientifically valuable, they're politically valuable. Information other systems would pay dearly for." Kaelith looked up at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. "You suggest I betray my people?" Her voice carried horror at the thought. Marcus shook his head. "I'm suggesting you stop letting them define you. You're not their property. You're not their mistake. You're someone with abilities they were too blind to recognize." The comm panel crackled, and Senna Vox's voice cut through. "Marcus, Thresh is calling a meeting. Everyone who stood with you at the garden wants to discuss options. We've got 23 hours to figure something out." Kaelith's luminescence flickered with uncertainty. "What can a gathering of outcasts do against a royal fleet?" Marcus smiled grimly, feeling that old defiance kindle in his chest. "Let's find out." The rust garden overflowed with bodies, every outcast and margin dweller on Threshold Station crammed into Thresh's bar like refugees seeking sanctuary. Marcus and Kaelith entered to a hush that felt almost reverent, faces turning toward them with expressions ranging from curiosity to determination. Senna Vox stood at the center, her cybernetic arm projecting a holographic countdown. 22 hours until the Luminaran transport arrived. 22 hours to decide if dignity was worth fighting for. "They're threatening war over one person," Senna said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Which means she's worth more than they're letting on." She gestured to Kaelith, who stood partially hidden behind Marcus, her glow subdued. "Show them what you showed me." Marcus had shared the frequency maps with Senna earlier, trusting her discretion. Now he activated the portable amplifier, and Kaelith stepped forward with trembling hands. When she touched the device, the bar erupted with holographic light. Ancient trade routes blazed across the air, connecting systems in ways that made the crowd gasp collectively. Thresh whistled low. "That's worth more than every ship on this station combined." He looked at Kaelith with new respect. "No wonder they want you back. You're not a defect. You're a treasure they were too stupid to recognize." Kaelith's eyes widened, her luminescence strengthening as she heard her value spoken aloud by strangers who owed her nothing. A dockworker named Chen spoke up from the back. "If we help her stay, we make enemies of Luminara. That's a death sentence for most of us." Silence fell, heavy with the weight of consequences. Then a salvager Marcus didn't know stood. "I've been called defective my whole life because I lost my legs in a mining accident, told I was worthless, that augments made me less than human." She gestured to her mechanical legs. "But I walk, I work, I matter. If we let them take her, we're saying they're right about all of us." Others nodded, a ripple of agreement spreading through the crowd. One by one, people stood, the forgotten, the discarded, the ones society had deemed not worth the effort. Senna pulled up station schematics. "We can't fight a royal fleet, but we can make sure they never find her. The lower maintenance tunnels connect to independent freighter docks. I've got a ship that can ghost past their sensors." She looked at Kaelith. "Question is, where do you want to go?" Kaelith stood silent, processing the impossible reality that people she'd just met were willing to risk everything for her freedom. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strength Marcus hadn't heard before. "I want to build something," she said, her luminescence pulsing steady and true. "A place for those who do not fit. A station where frequency matters more than conformity." She looked at Marcus, then at the crowd. "You have all shown me that worth is not determined by those who discard us. Let us prove it to everyone else." The bar erupted in affirmation, voices raised in defiant agreement, and as the countdown ticked toward midnight, something shifted in the cramped space. Not revolution, but something quieter and more dangerous, the recognition that dignity, once claimed, could not be traded away.